To the world, Dean Martin was the man who never looked shaken. The smile, the voice, the calm. But what most people never noticed is how carefully that calm was protected. One night, under bright stage lights and polite applause, a message reached him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't violent, but it was meant for him. The audience laughed. Dean Martin didn't, because he understood something the room didn't. Some warnings aren't delivered in anger. They're delivered in a way that makes silence the only safe response. In today's video, you're going to learn what actually happened that night, who was in the room, why that message mattered, and why Dean Martin's reaction was not confidence, but calculation. We'll look at the world he was performing in, the unwritten rules of power at the time, and why moments like this were rarely reported the way they should have been. This isn't a story about rumors. It's about understanding context. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why Dean Martin didn't blink, and how that single moment may have protected his career for years to come. Dean Martin entered a world where talent alone was never enough. The stages he stood on were filled with bright lights and polite applause, but behind that atmosphere existed something far quieter and far more serious. American entertainment in the middle of the 20th century was built on relationships, favors, and unspoken understandings. Performers were celebrated publicly, but privately, they were expected to understand the room they were in. Dean Martin learned this long before fame made him recognizable. Before television shows and sold-out venues, he worked in nightclubs where audiences were not just audiences. Some people came to relax, some came to be entertained, and some came simply to be present. Those people rarely drew attention to themselves, yet everyone else adjusted around them without explanation. Dean Martin noticed that adjustment. He noticed how servers slowed their steps near certain tables. He noticed how managers lowered their voices when speaking to specific guests. He noticed how jokes that worked everywhere else were suddenly avoided in certain rooms. None of this was written down. None of it was explained, but it was understood. That understanding shaped how he behaved on stage. To the public, Dean Martin appeared effortless. His voice sounded relaxed, his timing loose, his humor casual. He made it seem as if nothing ever truly bothered him. That image became one of his greatest strengths. But it was not innocence. It was awareness. In an industry where reactions were remembered longer than performances, Dean Martin learned that calm could protect you better than confrontation. Laughing something off often ended situations that arguing would only deepen. And silence, when used correctly, could say more than words ever could. This wasn't unique to him, but he mastered it. As his career grew, so did the types of rooms he entered. Bigger venues, more powerful audiences, more people whose approval mattered quietly rather than loudly. Dean Martin did not pretend not to see them. He simply never acknowledged them publicly. That was the balance. One night, in a room filled with familiar faces and unfamiliar authority, that balance was tested. From the outside, nothing seemed different. The audience was full. The lighting was perfect. Dean Martin moved through his performance with the same confidence people expected from him. Songs flowed naturally. Jokes landed. Laughter came easily. Then a comment came from the audience. It wasn't shouted. It didn't interrupt the show. It didn't sound aggressive to anyone who didn't know what to listen for. To most people, it sounded like part of the act, something playful, something harmless. But it wasn't meant for most people. The comment was specific enough to be intentional, timed carefully enough to be deliberate, and personal enough to be understood by only one person in the room. Dean Martin heard it immediately. This was not a moment that demanded a response for the audience. It was a moment that demanded a decision for survival. He could challenge it, drawing attention to something that was never meant to be discussed openly. He could ignore it completely and risk appearing unaware. Or he could do something far more precise. He chose precision. Dean Martin responded lightly. A smooth line, a calm delivery, enough humor to keep the audience comfortable, enough acknowledgement to show the message had been received. The crowd laughed. The show continued. To the audience, nothing unusual had happened, but for the people who understood the environment, a quiet exchange had just taken place. No voices were raised, no threats were spoken, yet everything that needed to be communicated had been communicated. This is where many stories simplify what happened. They describe Dean Martin's reaction as fearless or brilliant, as if confidence alone carried him through the moment. But confidence was not the reason. Experience was. He understood that public confrontation creates memory, and memory creates consequences. By refusing to escalate the moment, he removed the need for anything further to happen. Silence did the rest. After the show, there were no reports. No gossip columns picked up the story. No interviews mentioned it. That absence was intentional. Moments like this were never meant to be recorded. They were meant to be absorbed and forgotten by the people who didn't need to know. Dean Martin continued performing. His career continued growing. His image remained intact, and the public never realized that a line had been tested in front of them. What makes this moment important is not danger, but restraint. It reveals how power operated quietly, how control didn't need to be visible, and how survival in that world depended on understanding what not to say. Dean Martin didn't blink that night because blinking would have acknowledged something that was never supposed to exist publicly. He understood the room, and understanding the room kept him standing in it. After that night, nothing on the surface changed. Dean Martin kept performing. The venues stayed full. The applause sounded the same. If you were just another fan in the crowd, you would have never guessed that anything unusual had ever happened. And that was exactly how the system worked. Power didn't announce itself. It blended in. It stayed invisible unless you knew how to recognize it. What Dean Martin understood, and what many younger performers didn't yet understand, was that success in that era required more than talent and popularity. It required discretion. It required knowing which questions not to ask, which stories not to tell, and which moments to let pass without reaction. That understanding didn't come from fear alone. It came from observation. Dean Martin had watched careers stall overnight without clear explanations. He had seen performers slowly disappear from stages they once dominated. No scandals, no public incidents. Just fewer bookings, fewer invitations, and eventually silence. In most cases, the official reasons were vague. Creative differences, scheduling issues, changing tastes. But inside the industry, people knew better. Those performers had misunderstood the room. Entertainment during that period was tightly connected to ownership. Clubs, venues, and booking agencies were often controlled by the same small circles of influence. If you were welcomed into those circles, your career could flourish. If you weren't, talent alone would not save you. Dean Martin learned to move carefully through those spaces. He didn't isolate himself, but he didn't get too close either. He didn't align himself publicly with anyone powerful enough to draw attention, and he didn't distance himself so much that it looked like defiance. He stayed in the middle, friendly, approachable, and non-confrontational. That balance mattered more than most people realized. The night of the warning reinforced something Dean Martin already knew. The people watching him didn't need him to change who he was. They needed reassurance that he understood the boundaries. His response on stage gave them exactly that. By continuing the show without disruption, he signaled respect for the unspoken rules. By not reacting emotionally, he showed control. And by keeping the audience unaware, he protected everyone involved from unwanted attention. That kind of restraint earned trust. Not the kind of trust that leads to friendship, but the kind that allows coexistence. In those years, coexistence was often the safest outcome. Dean Martin's career after that moment continued to grow, but it also became more carefully managed. He chose projects that fit his image. He avoided unnecessary controversy. He stayed within the lines that had quietly been drawn. Some people later mistook that for indifference or apathy. They assumed he simply didn't care enough to challenge the system. But that interpretation misses something important. Dean Martin cared deeply about survival. He had built his career slowly. He had watched how fragile success could be, and he understood that one poorly handled moment could undo years of work. The warning he received on stage wasn't unique in form, but it was unique in visibility. It happened in public, disguised as humor, hidden in plain sight. And that made it more powerful than a private conversation ever could have been. Private warnings can be denied. Public ones, even subtle ones, cannot. That's why his reaction mattered so much. It wasn't just about avoiding trouble that night. It was about setting a precedent for how he would be treated moving forward. By showing awareness without resistance, he removed the need for further reminders. The people watching him had no reason to push harder. In many ways, that moment marked a shift, not in his popularity, but in how carefully his image was preserved. Dean Martin became known as reliable, predictable, safe. Not boring, but controlled. He delivered what audiences wanted without creating complications for the people behind the scenes. That reputation opened doors that might have closed for others. It also kept certain doors firmly shut. Dean Martin rarely spoke publicly about the pressures of that era. When asked about his career, he focused on the music, the performances, the joy of entertaining. He avoided discussing power structures or industry politics, not because he was unaware of them, but because acknowledging them publicly would have broken the illusion everyone depended on. The illusion that entertainment was separate from influence. In reality, the two were deeply connected. The audience wanted fantasy. The industry wanted stability. Dean Martin provided both by never pulling back the curtain. Other performers weren't always so careful. Some challenged authority openly. Some made jokes that crossed invisible lines. Some believed their fame would protect them, and for a short time, it did. But eventually, the invitations slowed. The venues changed. The opportunities faded. Dean Martin watched all of this happen, and he adjusted accordingly. His calm demeanor became more than a personality trait. It became a professional strategy. The smile, once seen as casual charm, became a signal. It told everyone in the room that he wasn't there to disrupt anything. He was there to perform, to entertain, and to leave without complications. That's why moments like the warning were never revisited publicly. Talking about them would have served no purpose. It wouldn't have benefited Dean Martin. It wouldn't have benefited the industry. And it certainly wouldn't have benefited the people who preferred to remain unnamed. Silence preserved balance. Over time, that balance allowed Dean Martin to age gracefully in an industry that often discarded its stars. He transitioned smoothly through different phases of entertainment: television, live shows, recordings, always present, never controversial. The public saw longevity. What they didn't see was the discipline required to maintain it. Every appearance required judgment. Every interaction required awareness. Every joke required calculation. Not because he lacked freedom, but because freedom in that world was conditional. You could do almost anything, as long as you didn't embarrass the wrong people. Dean Martin understood exactly who those people were. That understanding is what separates this story from simple myth. This isn't about a single clever response on stage. It's about a lifetime of decisions shaped by environments most audiences never considered. The warning was just one moment, but it represented an entire system operating quietly behind the scenes. And Dean Martin navigated that system with remarkable precision. He didn't challenge it. He didn't expose it. He didn't pretend it wasn't there. He adapted. That adaptation protected his career, his image, and his place in American entertainment history. But it also came at a cost, because living within unspoken rules means carrying things you can never acknowledge publicly. It means accepting that some truths remain buried, and it means performing not just for the audience, but for the room itself. By the time Dean Martin reached the later stages of his career, he had mastered that performance completely. The smile was effortless, the calm was convincing, and the boundaries were never crossed. To the public, he remained untouched. But beneath that surface, every decision reflected lessons learned long ago in rooms where laughter was not the loudest thing that mattered. By the time Dean Martin reached the later years of his life, the world around him had changed. but he had not. The rooms were different now. The faces were newer. The power structures were less visible, more polished. But the rules were still there. They always are. They just learn how to hide better. Dean Martin carried the same calm into old age, the same smile, the same quiet distance between himself and the truth people kept trying to pull out of him. When interviews touched his past, he redirected. When questions drifted toward uncomfortable territory, he softened them with humor. When moments hinted at stories the public never heard, he let them pass. Not because he had nothing to say, but because some things, once spoken, cannot be taken back. The night he was publicly warned never followed him as a headline. It didn't define him in newspapers or documentaries. It lived only in memory, in understanding, and in the way he carried himself from that moment on. That's the part people miss. They assume the danger passed. It didn't. It simply became quieter. Living inside unspoken rules changes a person. You learn how to measure words, how to read silence, how to sense when a laugh is no longer just a laugh. Over time, that awareness becomes instinct. You don't turn it off. You can't. Dean Martin spent decades performing in front of millions, yet parts of his life remained untouched by public understanding. Not because he was hiding something scandalous, but because he was protecting something fragile. Control. Control over his career. Control over his safety. Control over how his story would be remembered. That control came at a cost. The same calm that protected him also isolated him. The same restraint that saved his career required him to swallow moments that might have haunted him later. Smiling through pressure looks easy from the outside. Living that way for years is not. As he aged, the industry began to celebrate him as a symbol of a simpler time, a golden era, a man who made everything look effortless. Few asked what it took to maintain that effortlessness for so long. Even fewer wanted the honest answer. Because the honest answer reminds us of something uncomfortable, that success, in certain eras, required compromise, not always moral compromise, sometimes emotional compromise, sometimes silence, sometimes acceptance. Dean Martin accepted those terms without ever saying so out loud, and in doing so, he preserved the illusion the public loved. Toward the end of his life, as friends passed away and the world he knew slowly faded, that silence remained intact. The stories that could have been told stayed untold. The moments that could have changed how people viewed an era remained buried, not out of fear, out of understanding. Dean Martin knew that history doesn't reward those who expose systems. It rewards those who survive them quietly. That night on stage, when a warning reached him under bright lights and polite laughter, was not the most dangerous moment of his life. It was the most revealing. Because in that moment, he chose restraint over reaction, awareness over ego, survival over pride. And that choice echoed through the rest of his career. When Dean Martin passed away, the world mourned an entertainer, a voice, a presence, a smile that felt familiar even to people who had never met him. What the world didn't mourn was the weight he carried silently, the performances where he measured every word, the rooms where he understood more than he showed, the moments where not blinking mattered more than speaking. Those things don't make headlines. They don't fit into tributes. They don't play well in highlight reels, but they shape lives. Dean Martin's legacy is often described as effortless, but effortlessness, when examined closely, is rarely effortless at all. It is usually the result of years of learning what to give the world and what to keep hidden. That night, the audience laughed. They laughed because they didn't know what they were hearing. They laughed because the show never stopped. They laughed because laughter is easier than understanding. Dean Martin stayed quiet because he understood exactly what was happening. And sometimes, the difference between laughter and silence is the difference between ignorance and survival. That's what makes this story linger. Not the warning itself, not the people involved, but the restraint it demanded. Dean Martin didn't blink because blinking would have meant acknowledging a truth the room was never meant to hear. And in that silence, he protected not just himself, but the illusion an entire era depended on. Some stories are loud because they are meant to be remembered. Others remain quiet because remembering them would change too much. Dean Martin's story belongs to the second kind, and once you see it that way, it becomes impossible to unsee.